Officer Luke Peterson had spent most of his career patrolling the quiet suburban streets of his town. The routine had become second nature, and so had the hardened persona he wore like a uniform. No one in the neighborhood suspected the man behind the badge was anything more than just another officer doing his job. To them, he was stoic, distant, and professional. But beneath that exterior, Luke had his own share of regrets, particularly about the family life he had always delayed, telling himself there was time, until somehow there wasn't. Every day for years had been much the same, endless loops of patrolling streets, responding to minor incidents, and making small talk with the same faces. Luke was good at keeping people at arm's length, even his colleagues. They would joke, share stories about their families, but Luke, he never had much to contribute. There were no tales of birthday parties or weekend fishing trips to share, and after a while, people stopped asking. On this particular evening, as the late afternoon sun cast long shadows over the playground, Luke rolled past in his patrol car. It was the same scene he'd passed countless times. A quiet street, neatly trimmed lawns, and kids usually laughing on the swings or running across the grass. Except today, something caught his eye. A girl, all alone. She couldn't have been more than 10 or 11. Her dark hair swung as she pumped her legs on the swing, pushing herself higher and higher. Her face was turned away from him, but something about her lonely figure made Luke slow his patrol car to a crawl. He muttered to himself, "Just another afternoon." It wasn't unusual for kids to linger at the park after hours. They were usually called home for dinner. But this girl remained, her small frame outlined by the fading daylight. Luke felt a tug, something instinctual. He shook his head and continued on his route, his mind wandering back to his empty apartment. No kids, no family, just silence. The ache in his chest was familiar, but Luke had learned to push it aside, as he had done for years. Still, that little girl stayed in his mind, her solitary figure lingering even as his patrol car disappeared down the block. Luke wasn't one for indulging in sentimental thoughts. He had trained himself to ignore them, focusing on the task at hand. But something about that girl nagged at him, tugging at a part of his conscience he hadn't paid much attention to in years. It was a dull, persistent feeling, the kind that doesn't just go away. He told himself it was nothing, just a passing thought. The neighborhood was safe. Nothing bad ever happened here. The kids always went home. Yet as the evening grew darker, Luke found himself circling back toward the playground almost on autopilot. The streets were quieter now, and most of the kids had long gone home. His headlights cut through the growing dusk, illuminating the swings once again, and this time, his heart nearly stopped. The girl was still there, but now she was no longer on the swing. Instead, she was curled up on the cold playground floor, fast asleep. Luke pulled his car over to the curb, his pulse quickening. Something wasn't right. Stepping out, the crisp evening air hit his face, and his boots crunched on the gravel as he approached cautiously. His usual gruff voice softened as he knelt beside her. "Hey there, sweetheart," he said gently, giving her shoulder a soft shake. "Wake up." The girl stirred, her eyes fluttering open, full of confusion and fear. She blinked up at him, taking in the sight of the uniformed officer kneeling beside her. Luke smiled reassuringly, though inside, he felt anything but calm. "It's okay, I'm Officer Luke," he said, his voice unusually tender. "What are you doing out here all alone? It's getting cold." She sat up slowly, rubbing her eyes with small hands. Now that he could see her up close, Luke noticed how small and fragile she seemed, almost lost in her oversized jacket. Her shoes were scuffed and worn, her clothes wrinkled as if she hadn't changed them in days. There was a vulnerability in the way she moved, like someone who was used to being overlooked. I'm waiting for my mom," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Luke's brow furrowed. "Waiting? Where is she?" The girl, Leah, as he would soon learn her name was, looked down, her lip quivering. "She went to find work. 5 days ago. She promised she'd come back." The words hung in the chilly air like a punch to the gut. 5 days. This little girl had been sleeping outside, alone, for 5 days. Luke struggled to keep his composure, his years of training helping him maintain the calm exterior. But inside, his heart was breaking. He knelt down to be at her eye level, trying to keep his voice steady. "What's your name, sweetheart?" he asked softly. "Leah," she whispered, her voice small, her gaze downcast. "Leah," Luke repeated, trying to process the situation. "It's not safe for you to be out here. We need to find you somewhere warm to sleep tonight." Leah hesitated, hugging her knees to her chest. "But what if my mom comes back? She told me to stay here." Luke could feel the lump forming in his throat. The desperate hope in her voice was almost too much. He took a deep breath, glancing around at the darkening playground that had served as her home for the past few days. "I promise you, Leah," he said softly. "We'll look for your mom. But first, we need to make sure you're safe." The girl looked around, uncertain, her wide eyes filled with a mixture of fear and exhaustion. Luke felt a wave of protectiveness wash over him. She was just a child. She shouldn't have to be making decisions like this. "What if she can't find me?" Leah asked, her voice trembling. Luke's heart ached at the thought. "I'll leave a note," he said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "If your mom comes back, we'll make sure she knows where to find you." Leah looked up at him, her eyes searching his face as if trying to decide whether to trust him. Luke could see the battle going on inside her. The fear of leaving the one place her mother had told her to stay versus the fear of being alone any longer. Finally, she gave a small nod. "Okay," she whispered. Luke let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He reached out a hand to help her stand. Her hand was small and cold in his, and for a moment Luke was reminded of just how young she really was. He couldn't shake the thought. This could have been his child if things had turned out differently in his own life. But there was no time for what-ifs now. He led Leah to his patrol car, opening the back door gently. "Hop in. I'll take you somewhere safe for the night," he said, offering her a reassuring smile. Leah hesitated for a moment, glancing back at the playground. Luke could see the fear in her eyes, the worry that her mom might come back and not find her. He reached into his glove compartment and pulled out a notepad. "I'll leave a note here," he said, reading quickly. "If your mom comes back, she'll know exactly where to find you." He folded the note neatly and pinned it to the bench where Leah had been sleeping, placing a small rock on top to keep it from blowing away. It wasn't much, but it was all he could offer her right now. As he got back into the car, Luke glanced at Leah through the rearview mirror. She sat quietly in the back seat, her small hands folded in her lap, staring out the window. She looked so small, so alone. Luke drove in silence for a few minutes, his mind racing. What had happened to this girl? What had driven her mother to leave her in a playground for 5 days, with nothing but a vague promise to return? The questions swirled in his mind, but he kept them to himself for now. Leah had already been through enough. As they approached the station, Luke felt a sense of unease settle in his chest. This wasn't just another case. Something about Leah had pierced through his usual defenses, stirred emotions he hadn't felt in years. He didn't know where this road would lead, but he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't just leave her here. Not tonight. The police station was quiet that evening, the usual bustle of activity replaced by the soft hum of computers and the occasional rustling of papers. Luke led Leah inside, her small footsteps echoing in the large hallway as they approached his desk. "Here, sit down," Luke said gently, pulling out a chair for her. Leah climbed up, her legs dangling above the floor. She looked around the room, her eyes wide with curiosity and nervousness. Luke grabbed a blanket from the supply closet and draped it over her small shoulders. "I'll be right back," he said softly. "I need to make a few phone calls." Leah nodded, though she kept her eyes fixed on the floor. As Luke walked away, he could feel the weight of her situation settling deeper into his chest. A little girl, alone for days, waiting for a mother who might not come back. It was the kind of story that usually made him feel numb, something he had trained himself to block out after years on the force. But this time it was different. This time it felt personal. Luke sat at his desk, dialing the number for social services. He explained Leah's situation to the woman on the other end of the line, his voice steady and professional, but as he spoke, his eyes kept drifting back to Leah. She sat quietly, wrapped in the blanket, her small frame almost swallowed by the large chair. "She's safe for now," Luke said into the phone, "but her mother's been missing for 5 days. She says her mom went to look for work and hasn't come back." The woman on the other end of the line asked for Leah's details, and Luke relayed what little information he had. "We'll send someone to take her to a shelter tonight," the woman said. Luke paused, the phone pressed to his ear. A shelter. It was the logical step, the procedure he had followed countless times before. But something about it didn't sit right with him. The idea of Leah spending the night in some cold, unfamiliar place, surrounded by strangers, it felt wrong. After hanging up the phone, Luke glanced back at Leah. She was still sitting quietly, her eyes darting around the room, her hands clasped tightly together. She looked so small and vulnerable, a stark contrast to the tough, distant persona Luke had cultivated over the years. For the first time in a long while, he felt a tug at his heart, a pull that made him question the usual procedures. He sat down next to her, unsure of what to say. "Leah," he began softly, "can you tell me a little more about your mom?" Leah shifted in her seat, her small hands gripping the edge of the blanket. Her eyes were downcast, as if she wasn't sure she should answer. Luke waited patiently, giving her the space to open up in her own time. "My mom," Leah began, her voice barely above a whisper. "She's been working a lot. We don't have a home anymore. She said we could stay at the playground until she found a new place for us." She paused, her eyes flickering with uncertainty. "But she didn't come back. I don't know why." Luke's heart sank. He had heard stories like this before, families on the brink, pushed to the edge by circumstances beyond their control. But hearing it from Leah, in her quiet, broken voice, made it all the more real. "Do you know where she went?" Luke asked gently, hoping for some kind of clue. Leah shook her head, her lips trembling. "She said she was going to find work. I don't know where." Luke sat back, trying to process the situation. No home, no idea where her mother had gone. This wasn't just a simple case of a missing person. It was much more complicated than that. And Leah, this small, quiet girl, had been left to face it all on her own. "I'm sorry, Leah," Luke said softly. "I know this must be really hard for you." Leah looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and fear. "Is she coming back?" she asked, her voice trembling. Luke didn't know how to answer that. He wanted to reassure her, to tell her that everything would be fine, that her mother would walk through the door any moment now and take her home. But he couldn't make that promise. "I'm going to do everything I can to find her," Luke said, his voice steady. "But for now, we need to make sure you're safe." Leah nodded, though she didn't seem convinced. Luke couldn't blame her. She had been waiting for days, holding on to the hope that her mother would come back. And now, a stranger in a uniform was telling her to wait even longer. Luke stood up, running a hand through his hair. He was used to solving problems, finding quick fixes to messy situations. But this wasn't something that could be solved with a phone call or a report. Leah needed more than that. She needed someone who cared enough to stick around, to make sure she didn't fall through the cracks like so many others. He walked over to the window, staring out at the darkening sky. The shelter would be calling soon to pick Leah up. It was the logical thing to do, the right thing to do, according to protocol. But Luke couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't enough. When he turned back to Leah, she was still sitting in the chair, staring down at her hands. She looked so small, so alone. And in that moment, Luke made a decision. "Leah," he said, walking back over to her, "how about you stay here tonight?" Leah looked up, confusion flickering across her face. Here? Luke nodded. I've got a couch in my office. It's not much, but it's better than a shelter. Just for tonight. Leah hesitated, her eyes darting toward the door, as if she was still waiting for her mother to walk through it. But when she looked back at Luke, something in her expression softened. She nodded slowly. Okay, she whispered. Luke felt a wave of relief wash over him. It wasn't much, but it was something. He wasn't going to let her spend the night alone in a shelter, not when she was already scared and confused. He would keep her safe, at least for tonight. He grabbed a pillow and blanket from the supply closet and set them up on the small couch in his office. Leah watched quietly, her small frame huddled in the oversized chair. When Luke finished, he turned to her with a smile. There, he said, gesturing to the makeshift bed. It's not much, but it's better than a playground bench, right? Leah smiled faintly, her eyes still shadowed with uncertainty. Thank you, she whispered. Luke nodded, his throat tight. You're welcome. As Leah settled onto the couch, Luke sat at his desk, watching over her as she drifted off to sleep. He knew this was just the beginning. There were still so many questions left unanswered. Where was her mother? What had happened to their home? And most importantly, how was he going to help her? But for tonight, at least, Leah was safe. And that was enough. Luke spent the night in his office, unable to sleep. His mind kept racing back to Leah's story, her quiet voice echoing in his head. He had been on the force long enough to know that stories like hers didn't always have happy endings, but something about Leah made him want to fight for a different outcome. He couldn't just file this away as another case, another statistic. He had to do more. The next morning, Leah was still sleeping soundly on the couch when Luke slipped out to make a few more calls. He needed to find out what had happened to her mother. There had to be something, someone who had seen her, someone who knew where she had gone. Luke dialed the number of a local shelter, hoping for some kind of lead. He explained the situation, giving them Leah's mother's description. I've got a young girl here, he said. Her mother's been missing for 5 days. She said her mom went looking for work, but I don't know where. The woman on the other end of the line was sympathetic, but her response was the same as the others. I'm sorry, officer, she said. We haven't had anyone matching that description come through here. Luke thanked her and hung up, frustration bubbling in his chest, dead end after dead end. It was like Leah's mother had disappeared into thin air. But he wasn't going to give up, not yet. As he walked back into his office, he saw Leah stirring on the couch, her eyes blinking sleepily as she sat up. She looked at him, her expression wary. Did you find her? She asked softly. Luke shook his head, trying to keep his voice calm. Not yet, he said, but I'm not giving up. Leah nodded, though her shoulders sagged with disappointment. Luke felt a pang of guilt in his chest. He had promised to help her, and so far he had nothing to show for it. But he wasn't going to stop. Not now. Luke's decision to personally take on Leah's case would lead him deeper into the investigation of her mother's disappearance, testing his resolve and challenging his emotional distance. The more time he spent with Leah, the more he realized that helping her was about more than just finding her mother. It was about giving her the safety and care she deserved. The next morning, Luke was back at his desk, staring at the scribbled notes from his conversation with Leah. He was frustrated. No leads, no concrete information, and a little girl depending on him to find her mother. He knew that the first 48 hours were critical in most missing persons cases, but Leah's mom had been gone for 5 days now. If she hadn't turned up by now, something was definitely wrong. Luke picked up the phone, dialing a few contacts he had made over the years. He called local hospitals, nearby shelters, and even police precincts in neighboring towns. The story was the same everywhere. No one had seen anyone matching Leah's mother's description. Time seemed to stretch on as he made one fruitless call after another. Every dead end left Luke feeling more frustrated, but he couldn't let it show. Not when Leah was sitting in the next room, holding on to the faint hope that her mother would walk through the door at any moment. Leah had been placed in a temporary foster home that morning. Luke had arranged it through social services, though the idea didn't sit well with him. He hated the thought of Leah being shuffled around through the system, even if it was just for a few days. She had already been through so much, and he couldn't shake the image of her sleeping alone on that playground. As the hours passed, Luke found himself staring out the window, lost in thought. He couldn't remember the last time he had felt so connected to a case or to a person. He had always been able to keep a professional distance, never letting emotions get in the way of his work. But with Leah, it was different. She wasn't just another case file to him. She was a scared little girl who had somehow found her way into his heart. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. He needed to approach this from a different angle. Maybe Leah's mother had been staying with someone else, someone who didn't know the full situation. Or maybe she had gotten into trouble along the way. Whatever the reason, Luke was determined to get to the bottom of it. Luke grabbed his coat and headed out the door, the chill of the morning air hitting him as he made his way to his patrol car. His first stop was the diner down the road, a place that often hired workers for odd jobs. It was the kind of place that didn't ask too many questions, where people could make a few bucks under the table without much paperwork. If Leah's mother had been looking for work, she might have ended up here. The bell above the diner's door jingled as Luke stepped inside. The smell of coffee and frying bacon filled the air, and a few regulars sat at the counter, sipping from their mugs. Luke approached the woman behind the register, flashing his badge. "I'm Officer Luke Peterson," he said, his tone professional. "I'm looking for information about a woman who may have come in here looking for work recently." The waitress raised an eyebrow, glancing up from the register. "We get a lot of people looking for work around here. You'll have to be more specific." Luke pulled out the photo of Leah's mother, the one Leah had drawn for him as best as she could remember. It wasn't much, but it was all they had. "Her name is Nicole," he said. "She's been missing for about 5 days. Her daughter is waiting for her." The waitress frowned, studying the photo. "Sorry, officer, but I don't think I've seen her. We don't get many new faces around here." Luke's heart sank, though he wasn't surprised. He had learned not to expect miracles in this line of work. "Thanks anyway," he said, sliding the photo back into his pocket. As he left the diner, Luke felt the familiar weight of disappointment settle on his shoulders. He had been hoping for something, anything to give him a lead. But once again, he found himself back at square one. Back in his patrol car, Luke rubbed his tired eyes, feeling the exhaustion of the last few days catching up to him. He couldn't give up, not yet. He owed it to Leah to keep going, to find her mother and bring her back. But the more time passed, the more it felt like he was chasing shadows. Luke started the engine, pulling out of the diner's parking lot and heading toward the next spot on his list. He wasn't giving up. Not yet. The next stop on Luke's search was a nearby convenience store, the kind that stayed open late and paid cash for under-the-table work. He stepped inside, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead as he approached the counter. "Can I help you?" the clerk asked, eyeing Luke's uniform. "I'm looking for information about a woman who may have come in looking for work," Luke said, pulling out the photo of Nicole again. "Her name's Nicole Thompson. She's been missing for 5 days, and her daughter is waiting for her." The clerk squinted at the photo, then shook his head. "Sorry, officer, I haven't seen her." Luke felt his frustration mounting, another dead end. "Do you know if anyone around here might have seen her?" Luke pressed. "I'm trying to track down where she might have gone." The clerk shrugged. "You could try the shelter a few blocks over. Sometimes people looking for work hang out there." Luke nodded, though he had already called the shelter earlier that morning. Still, it was worth another visit. He thanked the clerk and headed out into the cold afternoon air. As he drove toward the shelter, Luke couldn't help but feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He had handled missing persons cases before, but this one felt different. Maybe it was because of Leah, the way she had looked up at him with those big, trusting eyes. Or maybe it was because he couldn't shake the feeling that this case was more complicated than it seemed. When Luke arrived at the shelter, the receptionist greeted him with a tired smile. She was used to seeing police officers come through, usually with questions about missing people or disturbances. Luke explained the situation, showing her the photo of Nicole. The receptionist studied the photo for a moment, then shook her head. "We haven't had anyone matching that description come through here recently. Sorry, officer." Luke nodded, though his heart sank a little further. Another dead end. He was starting to run out of places to look. He turned to leave, but the receptionist stopped him. "Wait," she said. "You might want to check with the hospital. Sometimes people end up there if they get hurt, or if something goes wrong." Luke paused, considering her words. He hadn't thought about that. It wasn't uncommon for people in desperate situations to wind up in the hospital, either from an accident or some other kind of trouble. It was worth a shot. "Thanks," Luke said, giving her a brief nod. "I'll check it out." The hospital was a sprawling building, its sterile white walls and the smell of antiseptic hitting Luke the moment he walked through the doors. He approached the front desk, showing his badge to the nurse behind the counter. "I'm Officer Luke Peterson," he said. "I'm looking for a woman named Nicole Thompson. She's been missing for about 5 days. I was told she might have come through here." The nurse raised an eyebrow, then tapped a few keys on her computer. "Give me a second," she said, scanning the list of patients. Luke waited, his heart pounding in his chest. He had no idea what he would do if Nicole was here, or worse, if she wasn't. Every minute that passed felt like a lifetime, the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. Leah was counting on him. He couldn't fail her. Finally, the nurse looked up from her screen. "We did have someone matching that description come in a few days ago," she said. "She was brought in after a car accident. Pretty bad shape, too." Luke's heart skipped a beat. "Is she still here?" The nurse nodded. "Room 342, but officer..." She hesitated, her eyes softening. "She's in a coma. She hasn't woken up since the accident." Luke's breath caught in his throat. A coma. That was why Nicole hadn't come back for Leah. She hadn't abandoned her daughter. She had been lying in a hospital bed, unconscious all this time. He felt a surge of relief mixed with dread. He had found her. But what now? How was he going to explain this to Leah? How could he tell her that her mother might not wake up, that the reunion she had been hoping for might not happen? Luke took a deep breath, thanking the nurse before making his way to Nicole's room. His mind raced with thoughts of Leah, waiting in her foster home, holding on to the hope that her mother would come back for her. He couldn't shake the image of her sitting on that playground, waiting for a promise that might never be kept. As he approached room 342, Luke paused outside the door, his heart pounding in his chest. He had faced countless difficult situations in his career, but this felt different. This was personal. Luke pushed the door open quietly, stepping inside. The room was dimly lit, the soft beep of the machines filling the air. Nicole lay in the hospital bed, her face pale and bruised, her body hooked up to various monitors and IVs. Luke approached slowly, his throat tight as he looked down at her. This was the woman Leah had been waiting for, the woman who had left her in a playground with nothing but a promise to return. And now she was lying here, unable to fulfill that promise. Luke sank into the chair beside the bed, staring at Nicole's face. There was something familiar about her features, something that tugged at the edges of his memory. He had seen her before, but he couldn't place where or when. It didn't matter now. What mattered was Leah. As Luke sat there, he made a silent vow. He would be the one to keep the promise that Nicole couldn't. He would take care of Leah, make sure she was safe, and do everything he could to help her through this. He reached out, gently taking Nicole's hand in his. "I'll take care of her," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I promise." The hospital room felt unnaturally quiet. The soft hum of the machines that monitored Nicole's vitals were the only sounds breaking the silence. Luke sat in the chair by her bed, his mind racing with thoughts of Leah. The realization that her mother had been lying here, helpless, while Leah waited for days in the cold, hit him like a punch to the gut. He had seen plenty of tough situations in his time as a police officer, but something about this one had crawled under his skin. Maybe it was the look in Leah's eyes, that fragile hope that her mother would come back for her, the way she trusted him when he promised to help. Or maybe it was the deeper sense of responsibility he felt now that he had found Nicole. Luke looked at Nicole's face, bruised and swollen from the accident. Despite the injuries, there was something about her that seemed oddly familiar. He squinted, trying to place the memory. Her features, her eyes, the curve of her mouth, something tugged at his subconscious, but he couldn't quite grasp it. He leaned back in the chair, staring at the ceiling, piecing together everything he had learned about Nicole and Leah over the past few days. This was more than just a routine case now. He wasn't just trying to reunite a mother with her child. It felt like he was part of something bigger, something he didn't fully understand yet. The more Luke thought about it, the more he realized just how deeply he had gotten involved. It wasn't just about finding Nicole anymore. It was about taking care of Leah, making sure she had someone she could rely on while her mother lay here, unable to wake up. Luke knew he needed to talk to Leah. He couldn't put it off any longer. She needed to know about her mother's condition. But how was he supposed to explain it? How could he tell a child that the person she had been waiting for might not come back for a long time, if at all? He stood up, taking one last look at Nicole before leaving the room. "I'll be back," he whispered, as if she could hear him. "I'll take care of Leah. Don't worry." Back at the station, Luke sat at his desk, tapping his fingers on the worn wood surface. He had been wrestling with how to break the news to Leah, but no matter how many times he rehearsed it in his head, it didn't get any easier. He knew there was no right way to tell a child that her mother was in a coma, but he had to find the words somehow. Leah had been staying at the temporary foster home for a couple of days now. Luke had checked in on her regularly, bringing her small treats and asking how she was holding up. She was always polite, always hopeful that her mom would come back soon. He could see the worry in her eyes, though she never said it out loud. It was the unspoken fear that had probably been haunting her since the day her mom didn't return. "Hi." Luke picked up the phone and dialed the foster home's number. It rang a few times before a woman answered. "Hello, this is Officer Luke Peterson," he said. "I'm calling to check on Leah Thompson." "Oh, Leah's doing fine," the woman on the other end of the line replied. "She's been very quiet, but she's adjusting. Do you want to speak with her?" Luke hesitated for a moment, then nodded, though she couldn't see him. "Yes, please." There was a brief shuffle on the other end, and then Leah's small voice came through. "Hello?" "Hey, Leah," Luke said gently. "It's Officer Luke. How are you doing, kiddo?" "I'm okay," Leah replied, though her voice sounded strained, as if she wasn't sure whether to believe her own words. Luke took a deep breath. "I've got some news, Leah. It's about your mom." The line went quiet for a moment, and Luke could almost hear Leah holding her breath. "Did you find her?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I did," Luke said softly. "But she's in the hospital. She was in an accident." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Luke could feel his heart pounding in his chest, the silence stretching on. "Is she okay?" Leah finally asked, her voice trembling. Luke closed his eyes, searching for the right words. She's in a coma right now. That means she's sleeping, and the doctors are taking care of her. But we don't know when she'll wake up." Leah didn't respond right away. When she finally spoke, her voice was so quiet, Luke almost didn't hear her. "Is she going to come back?" Luke's throat tightened. He had dealt with all kinds of situations before, but nothing had prepared him for this. "I don't know, Leah," he said softly. "But the doctors are doing everything they can to help her, and I promise you I'm going to be here for you. I'll help you through this." There was a sniffle on the other end of the line. "Okay," Leah whispered. "Thank you." Luke's heart ached for her. She was just a kid, dealing with something no child should ever have to go through. He wished he could do more, but for now, all he could do was keep his promise, to stay by her side and help her through whatever came next. Later that afternoon, Luke drove to the foster home to visit Leah in person. As he pulled up in front of the small house, he took a deep breath, trying to steel himself for what was bound to be a difficult conversation. He knew Leah needed someone to lean on right now, and whether he was ready or not, he was going to be that person for her. The door opened and Leah came out, her small frame bundled in a jacket too big for her. She looked up at Luke with wide eyes, as if she were searching for something. Hope, reassurance, anything to make her feel safe. "Hey there," Luke said, crouching down to her level. "How are you holding up?" Leah shrugged, her eyes dropping to the ground. "I don't know," she said quietly. Luke's heart broke at the sight of her, this little girl who had been through so much in such a short amount of time. He reached out, gently placing a hand on her shoulder. "It's going to be okay," he said softly. "I'm here for you, Leah. We're going to get through this together." Leah nodded, though her eyes were filled with uncertainty. "Do you think my mom will wake up?" she asked, her voice trembling. Luke hesitated for a moment, then gave her a small, reassuring smile. "I hope so," he said honestly. "But no matter what happens, I'm not going anywhere. You're not alone in this." Leah looked up at him, her eyes brimming with tears. She didn't say anything, but the way she clung to Luke's words told him everything he needed to know. She was scared, but she trusted him. And that trust was something Luke wasn't going to break. He stood up, taking Leah's small hand in his. "How about we go for a little walk?" he suggested, trying to lighten the mood. Leah nodded, and together they walked down the quiet street, her small hand gripping his tightly. As they walked, Luke couldn't help but feel a sense of responsibility that went far beyond his duty as a police officer. Leah wasn't just another case to him. She had become something more, someone he cared about deeply. And in that moment, Luke made a decision. He wasn't going to just find Leah's mom and walk away. He was going to be there for her, no matter what happened next. He had promised to help her, and he intended to keep that promise, because now Leah wasn't just a case. She was part of his life. Voiceover transition. As the days turned into weeks, Luke's visits to the hospital became routine. Each time he would sit by Nicole's bedside, updating her on Leah's progress and talking to her as if she could hear him. He told her about Leah's bravery, about how she was holding up, even though they both knew it wasn't easy. Luke couldn't help but feel that in some way, Nicole knew he was there. He had no idea if she would ever wake up, but he wasn't giving up hope. He couldn't, not for Leah's sake. Every time he left the hospital, Luke would drive to the foster home to check on Leah. They had developed a quiet routine. He'd bring her small gifts, like a coloring book or a new stuffed animal, and they would talk about her day. Sometimes she would ask about her mom, and Luke would reassure her that they were doing everything they could. It wasn't much, but it was enough for now. And slowly, without even realizing it, Luke found himself becoming more than just a police officer to Leah. He was becoming a friend, a protector, someone she could rely on when the world around her felt too uncertain. Luke's life had always been one of routine, patrolling streets, responding to calls, writing reports. He had never let anything get too personal, always keeping his emotional walls firmly in place. But now, everything had changed. Leah had found a way past those walls, and Luke wasn't sure he wanted to rebuild them. It wasn't just about finding Nicole anymore. Luke found himself thinking about Leah throughout the day, wondering how she was doing, whether she was feeling safe, and what she might be thinking about her mother's condition. As much as he tried to focus on his other duties, his mind always drifted back to her. Every day after his shift, Luke would make his way to the foster home to check on Leah. It had become part of his routine, though it felt nothing like the routines he had followed for years. This felt different, important, personal. On one of those afternoons, Luke pulled up in front of the small house where Leah was staying. As he walked up the path, he noticed her sitting on the front steps, her chin resting in her hands. She looked deep in thought, her small figure hunched over as if she carried the weight of the world on her shoulders. "Hey, Leah," Luke called out as he approached, his voice soft but warm. Leah looked up, her eyes brightening slightly at the sight of him. "Hi, Officer Luke," she said quietly. Luke sat down beside her, the two of them sitting in comfortable silence for a few moments. He could feel the tension in the air, the unspoken questions and worries swirling between them. "How are you doing today?" Luke finally asked, glancing sideways at her. Leah shrugged. "I don't know. I miss my mom," she admitted, her voice small and fragile. Luke nodded, his heart aching for her. "I know, Leah. It's hard, isn't it?" Leah nodded, her eyes filling with unshed tears. "Do you think she'll wake up?" Luke took a deep breath, weighing his words carefully. He didn't want to make promises he couldn't keep, but he also didn't want to take away the small sliver of hope Leah was holding on to. "I don't know, Leah," he said gently. "But I do know that the doctors are doing everything they can, and I'll be there with you no matter what happens. You're not alone in this." Leah wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, sniffling softly. "Thank you," she whispered. Luke smiled, reaching out to ruffle her hair. "You're a tough kid, you know that?" Leah managed a small smile, her eyes still watery. "I don't feel tough." "Well, you are," Luke said firmly. "You've been through a lot, but you're still here. That's strength, Leah." She nodded, her small fingers tracing circles in the dirt beneath her feet. Luke watched her, feeling an overwhelming sense of protectiveness wash over him. He had always been the type to keep his distance, but with Leah he couldn't do that. She needed someone, and for reasons he couldn't quite explain, Luke felt like he was meant to be that person. As they sat together on the steps, a quiet bond formed between them. It wasn't the kind of bond that needed words or explanations. It was simply there, a quiet understanding that Luke wasn't just an officer in uniform anymore. He was someone Leah could count on, someone who would be there for her no matter what. In the weeks that followed, Luke's visits to the foster home became more frequent. He found himself bringing small gifts for Leah, books, coloring supplies, even a stuffed animal she had admired in a store window once. He couldn't help it. Seeing the smile on her face when she saw him brought him a sense of joy he hadn't felt in years. One day, as Luke arrived at the foster home, Leah came running out to greet him, her face lit up with excitement. "Officer Luke," she called, waving a piece of paper in her hand. Luke chuckled, kneeling down as she reached him. "What's that you've got there?" Leah handed him the paper, her eyes sparkling. It was a crayon drawing, 3 figures holding hands. A tall man, a woman, and a little girl. Above them, in Leah's handwriting, were the words, "My family." Luke's breath caught in his throat as he stared at the drawing. He recognized the figures instantly. The man was him, the woman was her mother, and the little girl was Leah. His heart swelled with emotion as he looked at the simple, childlike drawing. It was so much more than just a picture. It was Leah's way of telling him how much he meant to her. "Do you like it?" Leah asked shyly, her eyes wide with anticipation. Luke swallowed hard, blinking back the tears that threatened to form. "I love it, Leah," he said softly. "It's beautiful." Leah beamed, clearly pleased with his response. "I made it for you," she said, "because you're part of my family now." Luke's heart nearly broke at her words. He had never expected to form this kind of connection with Leah, but now that he had, he couldn't imagine his life without her. She wasn't just another case to him anymore. She was family. As Luke's bond with Leah deepened, he found himself spending more and more time with her. They would go to the park together, play games, or just sit and talk. Leah had started to open up more, telling Luke stories about her mom, about their life before everything had fallen apart. Luke listened intently, his heart aching for the little girl who had been forced to grow up too soon. One evening, as they sat on a park bench watching the sunset, Leah turned to Luke with a question that caught him completely off guard. "Officer Luke," she said quietly, her eyes serious. "Can I ask you something?" Luke nodded, sensing the weight of her words. "Of course, Leah. You can ask me anything." Leah hesitated for a moment, biting her lip nervously. "Do you think—" She trailed off, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you think I'll ever have a family again?" Luke's heart broke at the vulnerability in her voice. He had known this question was coming, but hearing it still hit him like a punch to the gut. He wanted to give her the answer she was hoping for, but he knew he had to be careful. "You already have a family, Leah," Luke said gently. "Your mom loves you, and she's fighting to get better, and you've got people who care about you. You're not alone." Leah nodded, though her eyes were still filled with uncertainty. "But what if my mom doesn't wake up?" Luke felt his throat tighten. He knew this was Leah's greatest fear, the one thing she hadn't been able to say out loud until now. He wanted to tell her everything would be okay, that her mom would wake up and they would go home together. But he couldn't make that promise. Instead, he reached out and took Leah's hand, holding it gently in his. "Whatever happens, Leah, you're not alone," he said softly. "I'll be here for you. I promise." Leah looked up at him, her eyes shining with tears. "You promise?" Luke nodded, his voice thick with emotion. "I promise." As the weeks passed, Luke found himself reflecting on just how much his life had changed. He had always been a loner, keeping people at a distance and focusing on his work. But Leah had changed that. She had shown him that there was more to life than just patrolling the streets and writing reports. She had reminded him of the importance of human connection, of love and family. Luke had never thought of himself as the fatherly type, but with Leah, it felt natural. He had taken on the role of protector, mentor, and friend, and in return, Leah had given him a sense of purpose he hadn't realized he had been missing. He wasn't just Officer Luke anymore. He was someone Leah depended on, someone who had become a part of her life in a way he never expected. And as he watched her grow stronger, braver, and more hopeful each day, Luke knew that he had found something he hadn't even known he was looking for: a family. Luke's transformation wasn't just about Leah. It was about realizing that he had been hiding from his own emotions for too long. Through his connection with Leah, Luke had rediscovered his capacity for love, compassion, and empathy. And in doing so, he had begun to heal the wounds he hadn't even realized he was carrying. Now, more than ever, Luke was determined to find a way to reunite Leah with her mother, to give her the family she so desperately wanted. But he also knew that no matter what happened, Leah would never be alone again. He would make sure of that. With Luke's personal transformation complete, he is now more committed than ever to finding a way to bring Leah's family back together. His role in Leah's life has shifted from protector to father figure. And as the story moves forward, Luke will face new challenges as he tries to balance his growing emotional attachment with the uncertainty of Nicole's condition. Luke had come to terms with the reality that Leah was now a central part of his life. Every day, he juggled the demands of his job with his growing responsibilities to her. But beneath the routine, there was always a quiet, persistent hope that one day Nicole would wake up and Leah's life could finally begin to resemble something normal again. Weeks had passed since Luke had last visited the hospital. He had grown used to his routine of caring for Leah, and though they never spoke about it, both of them were waiting. Every day that passed, Luke wondered how he would handle things if Nicole never woke up. He had come to love Leah like his own, and he knew he would do anything to protect her, no matter what. But one afternoon, as Luke sat at his desk, a call came that changed everything. "Officer Peterson," the voice on the other end of the line said. "This is Dr. Chen from the hospital. I wanted to inform you that Nicole Thompson has regained consciousness." Luke froze, the words echoing in his ears. Nicole was awake. After all this time, she had finally woken up. Is she okay?" Luke asked, his heart pounding. "She's weak, but she's responding well," Dr. Chen replied. "She's been asking about her daughter." Luke felt a wave of emotion crash over him, relief, joy, and a new kind of nervousness. Leah had been waiting for this moment for so long, but how would she react? How would Nicole feel, waking up after all this time to discover that her daughter had been taken care of by a stranger? "Thank you, Dr. Chen," Luke said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'll bring Leah as soon as I can." He hung up the phone and sat in silence for a moment, trying to collect his thoughts. This was it, the moment they had both been waiting for. But as much as he had hoped for this day, now that it was here, Luke found himself unsure of what would come next. Later that afternoon, Luke drove to the foster home to pick up Leah. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. How was he supposed to explain this to her? How could he prepare her for what was about to happen? When he arrived, Leah was waiting for him outside, her eyes lighting up when she saw his car pull up. She had gotten used to his visits, and seeing him always brought a smile to her face. But today, Luke knew would be different. "Hi, Officer Luke," Leah called as she ran up to him. Luke crouched down to her level, taking her small hands in his. "Leah, I have some good news," he said gently. Leah's eyes widened and she looked at him with hope. "Is it about my mom?" Luke nodded, his heart pounding. "Yes, Leah. Your mom. She's awake. She's in the hospital and she's been asking for you." For a moment, Leah just stood there, frozen, as if she couldn't quite process the words. Then, slowly, her eyes filled with tears and she whispered, "She's really awake." Luke smiled softly, pulling her into a gentle hug. "She's really awake, Leah. We're going to see her right now." The drive to the hospital was quiet, filled with anticipation. Leah sat in the back seat, clutching the small stuffed animal Luke had given her weeks ago, her eyes wide with a mixture of excitement and fear. She had dreamed of this moment for so long, but now that it was here, it felt overwhelming. When they arrived at the hospital, Luke took Leah's hand and led her inside. As they walked through the sterile halls, the tension between them grew, unspoken but palpable. Luke could feel Leah's grip tightening around his hand as they approached Nicole's room, and he gave her a reassuring smile. "It's going to be okay," he said softly. "Your mom is waiting for you." They reached the door to Nicole's room, and Luke paused, giving Leah a moment to collect herself. He could see the nervousness in her eyes, the uncertainty of what she would find on the other side of that door. "You ready?" Luke asked gently. Leah nodded, though her eyes were brimming with tears. Together they pushed the door open and stepped inside. Nicole lay in the hospital bed, her face pale but peaceful. The machines that had been keeping her stable were still there, quietly beeping in the background. But now, her eyes were open. She turned her head toward the door as they entered, and when she saw Leah, tears welled up in her eyes. "Leah," Nicole whispered, her voice hoarse and weak. Leah stood frozen for a moment, staring at her mother as if she couldn't believe what she was seeing. Then, in an instant, she ran across the room and threw herself into Nicole's arms, sobbing uncontrollably. "Mommy!" Leah cried, burying her face in her mother's chest. "I missed you so much." Nicole held her daughter tightly, her own tears falling freely as she stroked Leah's hair. "I'm so sorry, baby," she whispered. "I'm so sorry I left you. I love you so much." Luke stood back, watching the reunion unfold with a lump in his throat. This was the moment he had fought for, the moment Leah had been waiting for. Seeing them together, wrapped in each other's arms, filled him with a sense of peace he hadn't felt in a long time. For a few moments, mother and daughter held each other, their tears mingling with whispered words of love and apology. It was a sight that reminded Luke of why he had never given up, why he had fought so hard to find Nicole and bring them back together. Finally, Nicole looked up at Luke, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Thank you for taking care of her." Luke smiled, his heart full. "It was my honor," he said softly. "She's a special little girl." Nicole nodded, her eyes brimming with tears again as she looked back down at Leah. "You've been so brave," she whispered, kissing the top of her daughter's head. "I'm so proud of you." Leah sniffled, looking up at her mother with tear-filled eyes. "I was scared, Mommy, but Officer Luke, he helped me. He took care of me when you couldn't." Nicole's gaze shifted back to Luke, and for a moment their eyes locked. There was an unspoken understanding between them, a recognition of the bond that had formed between Luke and Leah during the time Nicole had been unable to care for her. It wasn't something either of them needed to say out loud, but they both knew that Luke had become an important part of their lives. Over the next few days, Luke visited the hospital regularly, checking on Nicole and Leah as Nicole slowly regained her strength. Each time he visited, Leah would run to him, her face lighting up with joy. It was a sight that never failed to warm his heart. One afternoon, as they sat together in the hospital room, Nicole turned to Luke with a soft smile. "I don't know how to thank you," she said quietly. "You've done more for us than I could ever repay." Luke shook his head, his voice gentle. "You don't need to thank me. I just did what anyone would do." But Nicole knew better. Not everyone would have gone to the lengths that Luke had gone to. Not everyone would have taken Leah in, cared for her, and fought to find her mother. Luke had done more than his duty. He had given Leah a sense of safety and love when she needed it most. "Leah tells me you've become like a father to her," Nicole said softly, her eyes filled with emotion. She's so lucky to have you." Luke's heart swelled at her words, and he glanced over at Leah, who was sitting quietly by her mother's side. "I'm the lucky one," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "She's changed my life in ways I never expected." Nicole smiled, tears shining in her eyes. "Thank you, Luke, for everything." As Nicole recovered, Luke's role in Leah's life didn't fade. If anything, it deepened. He had become more than just the officer who had found her mother. He had become a part of their family, a figure of stability and love in Leah's life. Luke's journey from a distant, emotionally guarded officer to a man who had found a new sense of purpose and connection was complete. He had helped reunite a family, and in doing so, he had found his own. The story of Leah, Nicole, and Luke is one of love, resilience, and the power of human connection. Through their trials, they found not only each other, but also the strength to rebuild their lives. And as they moved forward together, they knew they were no longer alone. Thank you for following along with this heartfelt story. If you enjoyed it, make sure to subscribe for more touching tales like this one. And remember, sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can change lives in ways we never expect.